What is it about the trees with hundreds of lights, snow slowly falling to the ground on a cold winter night, and children excited to get their presents from Santa, that reminds me of the horror of the First World War? Well, I have a very simple answer: music, and a particular kind of it. I listen to a band called Sabaton, a band that makes songs about military history from almost every era, from ancient Greece to World War II. They recently came out with a new song called Christmas Truce that reminds me of this very interesting moment from the First World War. So we are going to start in the beginning of the war because it is very relevant. When the First World War broke out in July of 1914, many people believed that the war would be a quick one and that it would be over by Christmas. But as a 21st century students of history, we know that the war did not end by Christmas. The assumption led many people to be very optimistic about what they would get from the war and that it wouldn't really bring many casualties. So by this point in the war, the race to the sea had already failed, so most of the war was a stalemate of trenches. This led to many generals reconsidering their options for advance. This, coupled with the overall lack of supplies on the front, led to a lull in the fighting near to Christmas. But enough with the prelude, let's get into the real event. Right before Christmas, Pope Benedict, the Pope at the time, asked the leaders of the warring countries to have a truce for the day. But the real quote is that the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang. Although he was largely ignored by the leaders and generals, it did reach the men in the trenches. On Christmas Eve, there are many reports of both sides singing Christmas carols and even putting up trees and candles. In some places, even on the eve, that some soldiers met out in no man's land to shake hands and just talk. The real magic, although, happened on Christmas Day itself, with many of the soldiers already in an unofficial ceasefire from the eve. In many areas, the dead were brought back to the lines, and some were buried in joint ceremonies. When out in no man's land, the men exchanged gifts like souvenirs, tobacco, and wine. One story that I want to talk about more in depth is about the story of British Brigadier General Walter Congreve. He wrote a note to the opposing general asking to declare ceasefire for the day, and had one of his soldiers go slowly over the lip of the trench and walk out into no man's land. Instead of being met by bullets, a German soldier went out and got the note, and the two sides talked. If you've ever heard of the Christmas Truce before this, you probably know about the football matches. During the ceasefire, many of the soldiers played unofficial games of football. Since real balls were hard to come across in the trenches, it is reported that they used cans of old food. Although, due to the ground being filled with holes from the artillery, some of the games were very hard to play. From reports given from one match played between the British and the Germans won with a score of 3-1. But in another game played between the Germans and the Scots won. Now, for most of this, I focused mainly on the Western Front, but that is for a real reason. On the Eastern Front, there wasn't much outside of what happened on the Western Front, just on a very smaller scale. The Eastern Front was filled with much more hate and anguish than the Western, so there was not much willingness to do it. But there were still some meetings in no man's land similar to the Western Front. There are some accounts that similar truces were called for New Year's Eve, and some even lasted from Christmas to New Year's Eve. But why do I have to specify that this is the Christmas Truce of 1914? Well, the reason is that these types of truces for the holidays never really happened later in the war because of the sluggish and it just being so awful for the soldiers. But with that somber note, this ends the tale of camaraderie in the trenches. But there is a lesson to be learned from the event that happened over a century ago, and that even though you are told that they are your enemy, and that you should hate them, sometimes a little peace is all that's needed. And that is the true meaning of Christmas to me. But before I go, I wanted to leave you with this quote from Alfred Anderson, the last surviving Scottish veteran of the Great War, who was on the front lines during the Christmas Truce. He said this during an interview done in 2003. I remember the silence, the eerie sound of silence. Only the guards were on duty. We all went outside the farm buildings and just stood, listening, and of course, thinking of the people back home. All I heard for 2 months in the trenches was the hissing, cracking, and whining of bullets in flight, machine gun fire, and distant German voices. But there was a dead silence that morning, right across the land as far as you could see. We shouted Merry Christmas, even though nobody felt merry. The silence ended early in the afternoon, and the killing started again. It was a short peace in a terrible war.